Forever and a Day. The 1939 World's Fair was a convergence of knowledge and wonder. As soon as she saw the fair in the distance, from the backseat of Sid's car driving across the new white stone bridge, Mary was taken aback by the beauty of it. From the Trilon and Perisphere at the fair center to the clean white buildings, Mary didn't know where to begin taking it all in. Luckily, she had time to figure out what she wanted to see and do while she was at the fair. Once they managed to find a place to park the car, it took them a half hour of standing in line before they could pay their admission and get inside the fairground. The men paid the admission, 75 cents per person, but Vasya insisted that the women pay for snacks once they were in. As they walked through the entrance, Mary wrapped her arm around Vasya's and walked close to her so that the men couldn't hear what they were talking about. "I don't know how things work in Russia, but in America the men usually pay," Mary whispered to Vasya. "They like it." "I don't like owing people," Vasya replied. Mary waved a hand in the air and said, "You won't. They get to spend the day with beautiful women. That's enough for them. They save up their money just so they can spend it on us." It didn't look like Vasya was understanding how these things worked. Obviously, she was not as familiar with the world of dating as Mary. After she had this talk with Vasya, Mary let go of her arm and drifted back toward Sam. Once she was walking beside him, she took his arm and walked even closer than she had with Vasya. "It's miles long," Sam told her. She put a hand on her head and looked around, asking, "Where do we even begin?" On his way into the fair, Sid had purchased an official guidebook, which he was looking through as they walked. As he flipped through it and Sam read over his shoulder, Sid perked up and suggested, "We could start with the sun worshippers." Sam immediately grabbed the book and said, "No." "It's culture," Sid argued. Mary had no idea what they were talking about. She'd never heard of sun worshippers, and she didn't know why Sam was so opposed to the idea. But she kept on walking and didn't ask any questions that might make her sound unintelligent. She was happy to go along with whatever Sam chose to do first. They found themselves standing in front of a large stucco building with obvious Spanish influence to the design. Above the door, there were intricate carvings and one word, spelled out in letters that were decorative enough to fit in with the carvings, while plain enough to be read by any person passing. Florida. Vasya stopped walking and stood in front of the building. She turned to the others and suggested, "Why don't we start where we are?" Mary smiled. "I've never been to Florida before." Sam handed the guidebook back to Sam and led the way into the building, with Mary on his arm. Once inside, they walked through displays of Florida's historical events and achievements. Sid got into a staring contest with Ponce de Leon, which of course Ponce won since he was a statue. Mary caught Vasya laughing at his jokes once or twice, though she didn't quite get the humor herself. By the time they walked out of the building, Mary felt like she had actually been to Florida and lounged beneath the palm trees. Over the course of the day, they walked across the fairground and saw all sorts of wonders that Mary never could have dreamed of. The General Electric exhibit, with man-made lightning dancing before her eyes. Inside the Perisphere, a large spherical building, which sat beside a taller triangular building that reminded Mary of a stiletto, there was a display of what cities might look like in the future. And when you walked outside, there was a sloped walkway that led around the sphere, bringing guests back down to the ground. When they stopped midway down, Mary looked out across the park and marveled at everything that she hadn't even seen yet. There were 23 states with exhibits of their own, so over the course of one day, Mary had traveled across the entire country, from the Alamo to Mount Rainier. They rode on a parachute drop, which rose 25 stories into the air and then dropped them. Mary screamed and closed her eyes, while Sam took her hand and held it tight. She wasn't quite sure whether it was an attempt to comfort her or if he was scared himself. Either way, she didn't mind it at all. She could tell by the way that Sid looked at the passing girls that he wasn't interested in Vasya very much, at least not romantically. They laughed and joked together, but she wasn't surprised that they hadn't hit it off. Vasya wasn't a normal girl after all. They ate lunch in Sweden from something called a smorgasbord, which made Mary laugh every time someone said the word. She laughed even harder when Sam dropped a meatball in his shirt, and the gravy left a rather noticeable stain. She joked that he would have to walk around with that stain all day long, to which he responded by buttoning his jacket and hiding the spot. At the Eastman Kodak exhibit, Mary and Vasya had their photograph taken with their faces inside of a Salvador Dali painting, and the whole group had a picture taken next to a miniature version of the Trilon and Perisphere. At one point, Vasya joked about feeling like a movie star, having her picture taken so many times in one day. In the Westinghouse building, they toured an exhibit which showed the world of the past, without the convenience of electricity, and compared it to the modern world. It also showed them a glimpse of what life would be like in the future. Of course, as she looked at the display of what kitchens would someday be like, her mouth fell open with awe. She joked about how lucky she felt to have running water in her own kitchen, and Vasya told her that she should feel lucky to have any kitchen at all. Vasya lived in one room, with a bed and a dresser. They saw a time capsule with items of 1939 packed away and not scheduled to be opened for thousands of years. Just seeing normal, everyday items displayed like that made Mary feel like a relic already. To think that the next people who touched that dollar bill or the radio would be living in a world so far removed from her own sent a chill through her. As she stood and looked at that display, Vasya and Sid were already starting to move on, but Mary looked over at Sam, who was standing beside her, and he seemed to be thinking the same thing that she was. She could see his eyes moving from item to item, and he appeared to be imagining those people in the future considering each piece, the same way that people of today think about ancient Egypt. There was also a robot in the Westinghouse building named Electro. The four of them stood in a crowd of people, looking up at the giant mechanical man, and suddenly Mary felt as though she had opened a time capsule that was sent back from the future. Electro counted and smoked cigarettes and answered questions. She could hardly believe what she was seeing. And to think that someday every house would have a robot of their own was beyond anything she could have dreamed of. When she had seen the mixer that was on display in the futuristic kitchen, she believed that to be impressive. The robot was like something from a children's story, the Tin Woodman from Oz. There was one moment during the day as they walked through the park discussing the marvels around them when Vasya paused. She stood in one spot, looking upward and holding a hand over her mouth, breathless. It took the others a moment to realize that Vasya wasn't still with them, but when they did, they turned back and saw her. They walked back to her, and Mary saw Vasya with the same expression on her face that Mary must have had while looking at the robot man. She looked up at the statue that Vasya was staring at and found George Washington, dressed in a long cloak, one hand on his sword and the other holding his hat as he looked out across the fair. He had one foot hanging over the base which he was standing on, giving the impression that he was actually alive and stepping toward the future. "I've heard stories," Vasya told the others. "George Washington riding off to battle, and the enemy trying their best to shoot him from his horse. He returned to his base, never having been hit by a single bullet, but with holes in his jacket. It was as though God himself had ordered this country to be. You have no idea." She looked over to the others and smiled wide, trying to make the moment less serious, never finishing that sentence. Mary smiled too, and attempted to help Vasya out by saying, "I always did love a man in uniform." Almost as soon as she said that, Sam looked down to the ground. Mary could see Sid turn toward him, looking uncharacteristically concerned. She didn't know what she said wrong, but she knew that she had said something. "Let's go check out that Wonder Bread building," Sid suggested. "I hear they're making real bread in there, and I feel like feeding the birds." They walked away from the statue toward the building with the polka dots, where bakers chased Wonderland characters through the front window. The whole time they walked, Mary couldn't help but wonder what she had said wrong. What wasn't Sam telling her? Joe's attempt to call Annalise went unanswered. He considered going there in person and sitting her down for a talk, but he didn't know what he expected to gain from it. She wasn't telling him what he needed to know, whether it was because she didn't know or she was holding back. Either way, he had to find his own road to take. That left him with the numbers for Max Weber. He called the numbers from the 1937 directory and questioned each person who answered. As expected, those who weren't listed in the 1939 directory were no longer at the 1937 numbers, and nobody had much information on where those men had gone. It was the last number he called, which proved to be the most interesting of the bunch. This time, after a woman answered the phone, Joe didn't start by telling her that he was looking for Max Weber. Instead, he said, "Is this Mrs. Weber?" "Yes," she replied. Her voice was weathered and controlled, quiet but not weak. She sounded like an older woman to Joe, too old to be Leah Meyer. He didn't know why he had changed his usual opening line. He was probably just bored of having the same conversation over and over again, but the change had made a difference. "I'm looking for Max Weber," he told the woman. The line went dead. She didn't bother to say that there was no Max living there, as one would expect if she hadn't heard the name before. The fact that she hung up the phone so quickly made it seem like he'd struck a nerve, at least in his mind. As Joe hung up the phone, he looked down at the piece of paper, which had the address written next to the phone number. The apartment was on 86th Street, which Joe thought was close enough to imagine Max Weber coming into contact with the Meyer sisters. He grabbed the piece of paper and stuck it in his pocket as he walked toward the door. He felt like he was getting somewhere for once, and that gave him a boost of energy. A boost which nearly caused him to plow right into Michael O'Shea as he stepped onto the sidewalk. "Morning, Joe," Michael smiled. Joe turned to lock the door to the bookstore, still feeling a need to rush, though he doubted that the apartment was going anywhere. "I haven't seen you around for a couple of days. I thought I'd stop by," Michael explained. "How is your friend doing?" "Annalise? She's good. She's home now." Good. I've been trying to get her on the phone, but she's a hard woman to get a hold of." "Don't I know it?" Joe replied, beginning to walk down the street. Michael kept pace with him, saying, "I was looking into her case again. I thought there was no case." "Well, a hit and run sort of changes things in the eyes of the law. I took the opportunity to look into the missing sister." "Find anything?" "Ever hear of Max Weber?" "The boyfriend who everyone says Leah ran off with." "That's right. Well, I looked into his record. He was a pretty active guy back in the day. Bar fights, protests. The man liked to cause a fuss, and didn't mind the cops getting in his way either." "Do you think he's the killing type?" "Hard to say, but I do know that he hasn't gotten so much as a traffic ticket in this town for about a year and a half. If I had to guess, I'd say that he probably did take off. The question is, why?" "That's what I'm hoping to find out." "You're not getting into anything dangerous, are you?" "Hard to say." "You know, you're not a cop. You don't even have a license to investigate." "Do I need a license to talk to people?" "No." "Well, I'm not carrying a gun or busting down doors, so I don't think I've broken any laws yet." Michael nodded. "I understand. But don't poke around too hard, or else you'll interfere with an ongoing investigation, and I'll have to make a show of telling you to stop." "Thanks for the warning." "Just be sure to return the favor if you find anything. Max Weber's been known to put people in the hospital." "With a car?" "With his fist." "I have a pretty good sense for when people are about to take a swing." "Yeah, I know. Just have enough sense to get out before it comes to that." The men said their goodbyes and parted ways, and Joe got to his car as quickly as he could. As he drove, he ran through all of the questions that he wanted to ask the woman who answered the phone. How did she know him? Why did she hang up? Most importantly, where was Max now? Maybe she knew something. If Michael was right and Max really had left town, maybe this woman knew why. That could be why she hung up the phone so abruptly. And if she was that upset about it, maybe she'd be willing to talk to someone about it. He hoped so, anyway. He had to pass the address before he could find a spot to park his car along the street. When he finally managed to park, he was 3 blocks away. The walk did him some good. It let him get a feel for the neighborhood, the stores, the people. As he was looking through the window of a clothing store, he accidentally bumped into a woman. After he apologized, she responded with a pleasant smile and a strong German accent as she said, "Think nothing of it." She was a happy woman, but not everyone on the street felt the same way. Joe could feel eyes on him from some of the windows up above. Some were curious, others suspicious. It wasn't an overwhelming feeling. There might have only been a few people, but there was enough of that feeling to make him take notice. He entered the building. It was a far cry from Leah Meyer's building. The floors were freshly cleaned. The paint on the walls wasn't chipping. It was perhaps a step or two down from Annalise's neighborhood, but he'd seen worse. The wall to the left was lined with mailboxes, each with a number and a name printed on the label. Joe scanned the names. Wolf, Werner, Schmitz, Berger, Ludwig, Albright. He was beginning to notice a pattern. The woman's accent outside, the names on the mailboxes. He was in a German neighborhood. It was hardly a shock. Every neighborhood seemed to have an uneven balance toward one mother country or another. But Meyer was a German name too, if he wasn't mistaken. "You looking for someone in particular?" came a voice from behind him. It was male, and he didn't like strangers very much from what Joe could tell. When Joe turned around, he found himself looking at a man in his early 40s, heavy, but in a way that struck Joe as being more muscular than fat. He had a harsh look about him as he studied Joe's face. "Max Weber," Joe answered. Once he stopped talking, he paused to feel the reaction of the man, like knocking on a pipe and seeing if someone knocks back. The man grew aggravated. His eyes narrowed. He took a deep breath. Finally, he said, "Are you the police?" For the first time, Joe heard a hint of an accent in the man's voice. Either he had been raised in a German-speaking house, or he had come to America when he was young. "I'm not with the police. I was just hoping that he could help me find a mutual friend," Joe told the man. "Max hasn't been home for a long time. Do you know where he went?" The man was still frustrated, but once he realized that Joe had actual business in the building, he seemed less annoyed with Joe himself. He said, "I don't. You might ask his mother, but I don't think that she's heard from him since he left." "Apartment 8C?" The man nodded. Just as he did that, Joe heard footsteps hurrying up the stairs. He looked toward them, as though he could see through the stairs and walls that separated him from that person. Of course, he couldn't see the person running up the stairs, but he got the distinct impression that they were reacting to his being there. They were startled and nervous. As Joe felt that person's emotions, he began to think back to all of the eyes he felt on him earlier, growing more paranoid by the moment. He pushed it aside. Joe gave the man a nod and started to walk away before the man asked, "Who is your mutual friend?" Turning around, Joe answered, "Leah Meyer. Her sister Annalise asked me to help find her. You wouldn't happen to know her, would you?" "Leah," the man replied, shaking his head. "I think I saw the sister once. She was standing in the lobby. One of the men in the building just brought her down the stairs, I think, because he was holding her arm as she looked up the staircase and yelled to someone." "What was she yelling?" "Tell him I'm Annalise," the man told Joe with a shrug. "That's how I remember the name." Joe nodded once again and was just about to walk up the stairs, but something stopped him. On a hunch, he asked the man, "You seemed annoyed when you saw me here, like I didn't belong." "We've had problems lately." "What kind of problems?" "The kinds that don't concern you." The man turned and walked away. Joe was almost compelled to follow him and find out more about these problems that they'd been having, but he stopped himself. He couldn't afford to get distracted, and odds were those problems had nothing to do with Leah Meyer. As Joe climbed the stairs, he passed another man who was making his way down. The man didn't appear to notice him one way or the other. He was in a hurry. He was annoyed and bitter as he walked, buttoning the top button of his shirt and tightening his tie as he went along. Joe moved on. He knew that he was in the right place, and answers could be waiting for him up ahead. He couldn't afford to stop and explore random curiosity anymore. He couldn't be distracted by everyone with an emotion. He needed to pursue the answers that he went there for and stay focused. On the first landing, Joe nearly stepped on an empty milk bottle that someone had left on its side. He imagined the comedy that would ensue if he stepped on it and fell down the stairs. He bent down to move the milk bottle, but as he reached for it, he stopped himself. He looked up toward the next flight of stairs and imagined someone stepping on the bottle on their way down. The proper thing to do would be to move it, but he didn't. Instead, Joe stepped over the bottle and left it as it was. That feeling of suspicion that he felt on the street never left him. He still felt as though there were people who knew that a stranger was in their part of town, walking into their building. Each floor he passed, Joe tried to get a sense of the people who lived there. He didn't expect to stumble upon Leah Meyer right there in the middle of Manhattan, but he was walking into the building of the man who sat at the top of his list of suspects, and he didn't know where that would lead him. Of course, Max Weber was the only name he had, so his list of suspects was perhaps a bit skewed. He wasn't used to this sort of investigation. The only thing he knew about the job was what he read in books and saw in movies. He was sure that he was doing it all wrong, but he felt compelled to keep moving forward. Something stopped Joe on the landing, one floor below his destination. He was struck by the same feeling of being watched that he'd felt on the street, only this time he couldn't shrug it off. People usually don't realize how often they're being watched at any given moment as they go about their everyday lives. Just walking down the street, you're bound to grab someone's attention, so it wasn't unusual for him to feel those eyes on him and the curiosity directed his way. In the building, things were different. There were less people around, and the curiosity and distrust that he felt were more pointed. Someone was hiding something. Someone was waiting to see if the stranger in the building was looking for them. He looked down the hallway at each of the doors that led to the different apartments, but he saw nobody. He took a step toward that hallway, curious to find the apartment with that person inside, but he stopped himself. He wasn't there to explore apartment buildings, after all. He was there to find answers about Max Weber. He turned and walked back to the stairs, hurrying toward the apartment of Mrs. Weber. When he reached her door, Joe found the hallway empty. There was a newspaper sitting outside of one of the apartments down the hall, but Joe didn't feel as though there were a lot of people on that floor. Most of them were probably at work or running errands. He just hoped that Mrs. Weber wasn't one of them. He didn't want to have to wait for answers anymore. He stopped at apartment 8C and stared at the door for a moment, just trying to get a sense of who was behind it. Of course, he could have just knocked, but Joe wasn't accustomed to knocking on doors and demanding answers. He wasn't used to looking for missing girls, and he half expected bullets to fly through the door as soon as he knocked. There was someone inside. Tired, perhaps, but no overwhelming emotions that would signal to Joe that this person had anything pressing scheduled for the day. He knocked on the door and waited. A moment or two passed. He could hear someone walking toward the door. He could hear their breath against the wood as they stood just on the other side of the door. This person was worried, sad, scared, so tired. "Mrs. Weber," Joe said in a quiet tone. He knew that she was merely inches away from him. "My name is Joe Oster. I didn't come to cause any trouble. I just want to ask you a couple of questions about your son." Her worry increased. "Do I still have a son?" she asked quietly. He didn't know how to respond to that question. Was she asking sarcastically because he never called or wrote to his mother? Or was she asking because she thought he might really be dead? "I was hoping that you might tell me where he is," he said. "I don't know where my son is. I haven't seen him for nearly 2 years. I can't help you, Mr. Oster." 2 years? I thought it had only been 1. "I think I remember when my son turned his back on his family," Mrs. Weber replied, without the sharpness that Joe would have expected from such a comment. "Good day. Ma'am, if I could just ask, do you know Leah Meyer?" There was a long pause. Joe wasn't sure if the woman was still standing at the door or if she had walked off. He didn't know if she'd even heard the question until he felt a wave of anger. "What does she have to do with this?" Mrs. Weber asked. "I'm afraid that Miss Meyer has disappeared as well. Some people think that they might have gotten married and run off." There was a laugh from the other side of the door, though Joe didn't feel any sense of joy or gaiety. He found the laughter puzzling. "I don't know where my son is, but I can tell you one thing. He would have sooner killed that girl than marry her." There was a coldness in her voice as she spoke those words. It sent a chill up Joe's spine, though the idea that Leah Meyer was dead had crossed his mind many times before. "I don't understand. I thought they were involved," Joe replied. "They were involved like a boy is involved with a tin train. She was a plaything and nothing more. My son had many toys, and none of them interfered with his primary interests. I wish they had. I wish some girl would have come along and taken his mind off of those people, but none ever did. Not as far as I know." "His primary interests?" Joe asked. Again, there was silence on the other side of the door. She was still there, but she was quiet for a long moment. She then said, "Do you read the newspapers very often?" "Usually." "Then, have you heard of the Amerika-Deutscher Volksbund?" Joe had heard stories of the German-American Bund over the past couple of years. They were American citizens with German blood who marched in honor of German glory and Nazi ideals. There had been a large rally held in Madison Square Garden earlier that year, which caused quite a stir. Most people didn't appreciate seeing the American flag and picture of George Washington hung beside the German flag, while supporters cheered for Hitler. The mention of the German-American Bund added a whole new wrinkle to the story of Leah Meyer's disappearance that Joe hadn't been expecting. "Your son is part of this group?" Joe asked. "Not my proudest moment as a mother, I assure you. But yes, he even went to one of their special training camps all the way in Wisconsin." "Do you know if Leah Meyer was part of this group?" "I don't know anything about them. If you want answers like that, you'll have to ask Peter, downstairs, 7B. He was a friend of your son's?" "Since they were babies," Mrs. Weber replied dryly. "His mother finally walked out on him 3 months ago. Can't say as I blame her. I'd have done the same if my boy hadn't saved me the trouble." Joe pulled a business card from his pocket and slipped it under the door, saying, "Thank you for your time, Mrs. Weber. If you remember anything else about where your son might be, please call my store." "You run a bookstore?" the woman asked. "What does any of this have to do with books?" Joe smiled. "I'm just doing a friend a favor. Thanks again." He walked down the hallway toward the stairs, thinking about the person who had been watching him earlier and the person that he heard running up the stairs. He didn't know what Peter would have to tell him, but the man was obviously nervous about something. He walked to the 7th floor and down the hallway, trying to pick up on the general feeling of the floor as he went. He could tell that someone knew he was there. They were nervous. He stopped in front of 7B and put his hand on the door, just trying to focus on that apartment alone. But before he could get a clear idea of what awaited him beyond that door, he heard the sound of glass breaking and a window opening. Joe didn't expect the door to open when he turned the knob, so when it did push open without any resistance, he was a bit surprised. Inside the apartment, he found a mess of newspapers and unwashed dishes. There was a layer of dust covering everything. On the wall, there was a poster, which advertised a pro-American rally back in February. Underneath the rally information, and the picture of a man holding a spear and a shield that had a snake crawling toward an emblem that featured American-looking bars and stars, small letters revealed that the rally had been put on by the German-American Bund. There was a German flag hanging on the wall next to the American flag. The sight of Old Glory next to the symbol of Nazi pride sent a wave of anger through Joe that was unmistakably his own emotion. There was a noise from one of the other rooms just off to the side of where Joe was standing. As he turned to investigate, he felt a cool breeze wash over him. Joe rushed toward the room where the noise had come from and found himself standing at an open window as soon as he walked through the doorway. There was no time for him to stop or think of a plan for the smartest way to handle a situation like this, so he ran toward the window and climbed out onto the fire escape. Looking down, Joe didn't see anyone. When he looked up, the fire escape was clear. Whoever had gone through the window was now out of sight. Joe had to decide which way to go. In either direction there were open windows. Peter could have gone through any one of them. He closed his eyes and listened to the sounds around him. More than that, he tried to feel which way Peter was going. It took him a couple of seconds, but Joe eventually felt the panic that he was looking for. It was what he would have expected to find in someone who was being chased. Near that panic, there was fear. Joe ran toward it, up the fire escape. He found himself outside the window of apartment 8C, where Mrs. Weber lived, but he heard nothing inside of the apartment. He was hesitant to stick his head through the window, for fear of being attacked without a chance to defend himself. He tried to think of some better way to go about the situation, but he couldn't come up with any. He didn't even know why Peter was running, though he suspected that the boy had a lot of people who would be chasing him down for a lot of reasons. Joe looked into the apartment through the window. Though he couldn't see much of the inside, The bedroom that was on the other side of the window was warm and inviting, not the type of place that you would expect to find a budding member of the Nazi Party. The floors were clean, the furniture was nice. Joe could even smell something cooking in the kitchen. He was beginning to feel more sorry for Mrs. Weber by the moment. Through a doorway on the far side of the bedroom, Joe could see the living room. It had all the furniture that one would expect inside of a home, but on the far wall, there were mirrors which hung on the wall, roughly 7 feet tall. They had a ballet bar in front of them. Joe recognized the setup as something that you'd find in a dance studio. Maybe Mrs. Weber had been a dancer or a teacher at one point, but the mirrors now had furniture in front of them. If she had once danced, she didn't anymore. The reflection in those mirrors proved to be handy. Through them, Joe could see more of the room than he would have otherwise. He could see the radio cabinet and a small table with a vase of flowers sitting on it. He could see an old picture hanging on the wall that the bedroom door was on, and the man standing in front of that picture, holding Mrs. Weber with a hand over her mouth. The man, presumably Peter, saw Joe as soon as Joe saw him. Without hesitation, he threw Mrs. Weber to the ground and ran toward the door. Joe could have gone to check on the woman and make sure that she was all right. He also could have chased Peter through the apartment. But instead of doing either of those things, Joe raced down the fire escape, through Peter's apartment, and into the hallway. He was just in time to see Peter passing that floor and moving down the stairway at full speed. Even if he ran as fast as he could, Joe doubted that he would be able to catch up with Peter and find out what he knew about Max Weber. But then, there was the milk bottle. The thought of it put a smile on Joe's face, and he chased after Peter at full speed. Floor by floor, it seemed as though Peter was picking up speed while Joe was losing it. Peter was a younger man, presumably with more to lose if caught than Joe had to gain by catching him. When Peter had reached the 3rd floor, Joe picked up his speed, knowing that there was only a short way left to go before the boy would trip over the milk bottle and fall flat on his face. But Joe was wrong. Peter didn't trip on the bottle. As he reached the first landing above the lobby, another man was coming up the stairs. That man leaned down to pick up the bottle, as any responsible adult would. Peter looked back to see where Joe was, just missing his chance to avoid running into the man who was coming up the stairs. When they collided, both men fell into the lobby. Joe ran to catch Peter, but also to make sure that the other man was all right. When he reached the bottom of the stairs, he found Peter struggling to get out from under that man, and the man struggling to get to his feet. "I didn't do anything," Peter called. "You don't strike me as innocent," Joe replied. "Are you a cop?" "No," Joe replied, turning to check on the other man. When he saw who it was, he was a little surprised. But he is. Michael O'Shea was on his feet now, dusting himself off and checking himself for broken bones. Mary, Sam, Vasya, and Sid had been circling the RCA pavilion all day. It was a priority on their list of things to see, but they wanted to end the day on a high note, so they waited until after dark before going in. The pavilion was a world of marvels. As soon as they walked through the door, Mary felt as though the entire theme of the fair suddenly made sense. She felt like she was inside the world of tomorrow. Greeting them in the lobby was a display of the new RCA television. They called it the Phantom Teleceiver because its case was made of a material that Mary thought was glass at first, but she soon learned that it was something called lucite instead. Regardless of how the television was made, it allowed the crowd to look inside of the television and see how it worked. Of course, it was all gibberish to Mary. She didn't understand how any of those tubes or wires actually worked, but something about seeing the display made the idea of a television seem real to her for the first time. She had never been able to imagine movies being beamed through the sky like a radio broadcast, until she could see the inside of the television and it looked like the inside of a radio, at least to her eyes. The Phantom was not turned on at the moment, but she and the others stood at the railing that surrounded the display, staring at the television in silence for a few minutes before Sid broke the silence by saying, "I think I'm going to like the future." "I don't see the point," Vasya replied. "If I want to see a movie, I'll go to a theater. If I want a radio program, I'll listen to the radio. Why do I need to watch a radio program being performed? You don't think it'd be nice to curl up in your most comfortable chair, in our case the one that doesn't wobble, And catch a show without having to get dressed or comb your hair? Sid argued. Vasya shook her head and said, Getting dressed up and making a night of it is half of the fun. Sid shrugged and said, That's fine, but I for one wouldn't mind being able to watch a baseball game in my undershirt. You're a charmer, Vasya quipped jokingly. Sid responded with a wink. The group made their way deeper into the building, looking at another one of the marvels of science. The display was of something called a facsimile machine. According to the man by the display, it was capable of sending an entire newspaper page across the country in just 18 minutes. Mary tried to wrap her mind around the uses for such a machine. She imagined someone in Alaska calling the bookstore and placing an order, and she could have the entire book facsimile to them overnight. Book pages were smaller than newspaper pages, after all. There was also a display for a new type of radio called FM, which seemed less thrilling when placed next to the televisions and facsimile machines. Finally, the group reached the television displays which were turned on and displaying broadcasts. One model of television on display featured a television, a radio, a record player, and a facsimile machine all built into one cabinet. Upon seeing that one, Mary's mind went to work on arguments that she could use with Joe, passing off the cabinet as absolutely vital to the success of their bookstore. However, given the fact that the cabinet went to great lengths to render books completely obsolete, she didn't think that her argument would hold much water. There were a number of televisions on display, showing broadcasts from NBC. At the moment, the broadcast was just an old woman cooking in the kitchen, which wasn't very thrilling. But to be able to see it in that way was exciting, Mary supposed. It would have been nice to watch a movie or something more interesting, though. And then there was the final display, a television set up differently than all the others. A crowd was gathered around this television, listening to a man speak about how they could transmit the television signal from outside the building into the pavilion, where everyone could see it. As the man spoke, Sam got a curious expression on his face. He turned to Mary and said to her, I think I know that man. You do? How? Mary replied. I saw him as I was leaving the office the other night. We spoke for a moment. By this point, the man was asking the crowd if there were any volunteers. Of course, everyone in the crowd raised their hand. Do we have any military men? The man asked. Over here, Sid called out, pointing to Sam. Sam immediately slouched down and smacked Sid's shoulder. He took Mary's hand and tried to step behind her, but by this point it was too late. The man's eyes were already on Sam. I know you, don't I? The man asked, though he couldn't quite seem to place Sam's face. Sam looked to Mary, who gave him a nervous smile and a nod, urging him to speak since she knew that remaining quiet would only make him look worse and embarrass him more. Finally, Sam looked to the man and politely said, Yes, sir. We met the other night at the office where I work. The man's eyes lit up and he held up a finger, saying, That's right, the man who doesn't like lawyers, though I guess that doesn't narrow it down very much. The crowd laughed, though Sam appeared to grow more nervous by the second. And you're a military man on top of it all, the man yelled. What branch, son? Sam started, but he didn't seem to have the will to go on. Navy, Sid called out. This time, Vasya jabbed him with her elbow. Navy, the man repeated. Well, we're all honored to have you here with us tonight. Let's give him a round of applause, shall we? The crowd applauded for Sam, and each clap of the hand made him shrink just a little bit more. He squeezed Mary's hand. For the life of her, she couldn't understand what was wrong with him. There was so much about him that she hadn't learned yet, but she could tell that he was upset, and that was enough to make her feel for him. She would hate to be in his shoes, with so many eyes on him at once. Come this way, Navy, the man told him. We'll give that lovely girl of yours a thrill, and she'll get the chance to see you up there on the television set. How about that? The crowd clapped. Sid whistled through his fingers. Sam let go of Mary's hand and started to walk toward the exit with the man. The whole time, Mary wrung her hands together, waiting for this experience to be over so that Sam could get back to having fun. It had been such a lovely day until that moment. When Sid turned to give her a smile, she shot him the dirtiest look that she could muster. What'd I do? He asked. You knew, Sid. You knew how much he'd hate being up there, the center of attention. How could you? She asked. As she said it, Sid's smile faded just a little. He turned back toward the television and waited for Sam's picture to appear. As he waited, Mary saw a look of remorse come over him. Finally, he looked to the ground, ignoring the display entirely. He and Vasya began a hushed conversation that Mary couldn't hear, because before she could get a good listen, a woman in the crowd yelled, "There he is!" Mary turned her attention to the television screen. On it, she saw Sam being walked in front of the camera, which was set up somewhere outside of the building. Lights were shining down on him, and he was squinting to keep from being blinded. Someone that Mary couldn't see must have told Sam to wave to the camera, because he looked awkward for a moment and then began to wave. She felt embarrassed for him. Even though he looked wonderful out there, she knew how he must have felt. She couldn't stand to watch that look on his face any longer, so instead, Mary looked to the man who was standing behind Sam. He looked even more out of place than Sam did, if such a thing were possible. He stood as still as stone, too far back from the cameras, as the lights just barely managed to catch him. One step back and he wouldn't have been visible at all. The man looked to Sam, and then directly into the camera. Unlike Sam, he wasn't squinting. He didn't seem bothered by the lights at all. Once she looked at that man, Mary couldn't take her eyes off of him. When he looked into the camera, it was as though he was looking directly at her, and the expression in his eyes was one of pure fear. "Are you okay?" Joe asked Michael. "I had a soft landing," Michael replied. "Who's this?" "This is Max Weber's best friend," Joe told him. "Max?" Peter asked. "I haven't seen him in years, and I don't plan to again neither. He might as well be dead for all I care." "Doesn't seem worth running over now, does it?" Joe asked him, throwing Peter down on the stairs and forcing him to sit while he and Michael stood over him. "I thought you were someone else," Peter replied. "We'll get to that in a few minutes," Michael assured him. "Tell us what you know about Max Weber." "I know he's a no-good double-crosser," Peter replied. "He abandoned the cause, and for what?" "You tell us," Joe shot back. "They think they're fancier than we are because they have funding and resources. They think we're a joke, but who's the joke?" "You tell us," Joe said once again, to which Peter said, "They are. Look, kid, I love games and riddles as much as the next guy, but my arm's sore and I have places to be, so could we cut this short?" Michael asked, with an impressive edge to his voice that Joe had never heard before. Then again, Joe was never part of an interrogation before either. "Leah Meyer," Joe said to Peter. "What do you know?" "Old news, yesterday's garbage," Peter replied. "She's missing. Do you think Max would kill her?" "Max? No, he ain't a killer." "I don't believe in coincidence, so if she's missing and he's missing, odds are they're missing together. Where?" "No coincidence about it. If she's missing, it's because she stuck her nose where it didn't belong. She had her hand in half the cookie jars in this city, if you know what I mean. A real wild girl, that one. Crazy, if you ask me. But Max found her amusing. I never did understand that part. If it were me, I'd have gone for the sister. She was a real number, that one. Nothing like her sister." "So maybe Max and Annalise had a thing going," Michael offered, looking at Joe. "No way," Peter laughed. "He'd have loved to have a piece of that pie, but she thought she was too good for him, probably because she really was." "When you say abandon the cause, what do you mean?" Michael asked. "The German-American Bund," Joe replied before Peter had the chance. Michael shot Joe a look that conveyed the annoyance, disbelief, and trepidation that ran through him at the sound of that name. "I know. I wasn't expecting to be dealing with nuts like that either," Joe said to him. "Nuts?" Peter replied defensively. "We're the true Americans here, none of that Franklin D. Rosenfeld nonsense. George Washington was a socialist, you know that? We're just trying to restore the founding virtues of this nation." Michael looked to Peter for a moment, and then back to Joe, and asked, "If a crazy man says that someone else is crazy, is that other person really sane?" Joe tried not to smirk too much, knowing that Peter would be less likely to talk if they kept making jokes about his fanatical ideals. Michael then leaned in closer to Joe and whispered, "We can't haul this guy out of here, not like this, not unless we want to end up like that Meyer girl. Get what you need and let's get out of here." Joe nodded and turned to Peter, asking, "If Max wanted to disappear, where would he go?" "If I knew Max as well as I thought I did, I wouldn't be here right now, would I?" Peter replied. "But I know that he wasn't a killer, So if you want to find out who killed Leah, I'd start looking for the guy who started filling Max's head with all those crazy ideas about numberology and whatnot. That guy made Leah look normal. What's his name? Michael asked. Gottschalk, Peter replied. Carl Gottschalk. If someone's out there killing people, that's the guy. He gives Nazis a bad name. Joe had the next piece of his puzzle. Now all he had to do was track down Carl Gottschalk and pray that he didn't get himself killed in the process. The rest of the night was quiet for Mary and Sam. While Sid returned to his usual fun-loving self and Vasya tried to keep him in check, Mary and Sam had other things on their mind. For Sam, it was whatever detail of his past he didn't want to discuss. And for Mary, it was that man she saw on the TV with Sam. More specifically, it was the expression on that man's face. She couldn't get that look of fear out of her mind. They left the fair relatively early that night. For Mary and Vasya, 10 o'clock was usually just the start of their day. So as they neared the city, she looked over to Sam, who was sitting beside her in the back of Sid's car, and asked him, "Would you like to get a cup of coffee tonight? I'm not tired. I don't think I could sleep if I wanted to." "Sure," Sam replied, trying to smile at her, but it was a strained smile. He immediately looked away from her again and stared at the card that he was holding in his hands, which the man at the RCA pavilion had given him just before they left. The card certified that Sam Dandridge, name written in with pen of course, had been televised at the RCA exhibit building of the New York World's Fair. Sid was a little bit jealous of that card when Sam got it. He made jokes about trying to change the name from Sam to Sid, but by that point in the night, it seemed like nobody else was in the mood for jokes. Mary felt a little bit sorry for Sid. He must have believed that they were mad at him for pushing Sam up in front of the crowd, but she didn't believe that Sam was angry, and she knew that she wasn't. Vasya had an early morning to look forward to, having promised a friend that she would cover a shift in a diner in exchange for that friend covering her shift at the bar. So Sid dropped her off at her building and walked her to her door. Mary didn't think that the two of them would be going on any dates in the future, but they seemed to get along in the sort of way that siblings might, always jabbing and bickering. While Sid was out of the car, Mary turned toward Sam and saw that he was still struggling with something. Whatever it was, it must have been important and painful, and he obviously didn't want to discuss it. She put a hand on top of his and smiled at him. He looked at her and smiled back. "Sometimes, when I'm in a really good mood and I'm having a laugh, I suddenly think to myself, I can't wait to tell Norma about this," Mary told Sam. "And then I suddenly remember that I can't tell her, because she's dead, and Maggie's dead, and my mother's dead, and my father's dead." The look in Sam's eyes shifted from one of deep thought and sorrow to one of pity and maybe just a little bit of awe. Mary nodded and told him, "I know a lot of dead people, and when those thoughts come to me, I usually get quiet and sad and I don't feel much like talking anymore. But after some time, I try to remind myself that nothing has really changed since before I thought of them, you know? What I mean is, I was happy and I was having a good time before I thought of them, and nothing has really changed except what I was thinking about. So why not go back to that moment and be happy again?" Even as she said it, she didn't think that she was making any sense. The idea had seemed so simple and clear in her own mind, but to hear it spoken out loud sounded like gibberish. She couldn't help but frown at how little help she had been. And then Sam kissed her, just like that. He leaned across the back seat of the car and held her head in his hand as his lips met hers. It was a simple, sweet kiss, and yet to Mary it felt as though the entire course of human history had changed in that very moment. "All right, kids, that's enough of that. Just what kind of establishment do you think we're running here?" Sid joked as he got back into the car. Mary and Sam both smiled at the joke. This time their smiles weren't strained at all. They had found their way back to the happiness of the day. Sid's next stop was his and Sam's apartment building. Sid wasn't planning on going out for coffee with Mary and Sam wanted to change his shirt after getting it dirtied by the Swedish meatball at lunch. Mary went upstairs with the men, which her mother wouldn't have approved of very much at all, and she waited in the living area while Sam went into his bedroom to get a clean shirt. Mary wasn't sure what she expected to see when she entered the apartment. It was a far cry from her own much larger apartment. It was dirty, which Sid explained away by telling Mary that their maid was out of town on important business with the government. Old FDR cleans up Hoover's mess just fine, but someone's got to clean up his, Sid joked. While Sid tried to keep her entertained, Mary looked around the place, trying to see what she could learn about the men who lived there. The furnishings were sparse. The floors were dirty. The table by the door was scratched up. But the thing that Mary noticed more than anything else in the room was the bookcase, which had a few books, but more framed photographs of what Mary assumed were friends or family members. She walked to the pictures and began to look at them, studying the faces of the people who were forever captured in those moments in time, as Norma always called them. They seemed like a nice bunch, if perhaps a bit stuffy. "Those are Sam's," Sid told her, as he tried to hide a stack of old newspapers under a blanket. "His family?" she asked. "Yeah. I'd put some of my own out there, but no pictures survived after the villagers chased us out of town." Mary picked up one of the pictures and looked more closely. The first thing that she noticed in that picture was Sam, in a naval uniform, smiling in a way that she hadn't ever seen before. There was something about his eyes that looked so much younger, so much more carefree. Say, maybe you'd like to get a tour of the kitchen," Sid said, though she wasn't paying him much attention. Her eyes then drifted over to the other man who was in the photograph with Sam. He was young and wearing a pea coat, but he didn't look like a Navy man. He was smiling just as widely as Sam, so it took Mary a moment to realize that she had seen this man before. It was the man that she saw on the television, standing behind Sam. A chill ran through her and she couldn't move. All she could do was stare at the face of that man and remember the look of fear that she had seen in his eyes earlier that night. "What I mean to say is, maybe you shouldn't look at those," Sid said as he took the picture from her and put it back on the shelf. "I mean, Sam would probably want to do that sort of thing with you, right? Because couples do that kind of thing, I've heard." Mary was still holding her hand up where it had been when she was holding the picture. Now it was shaking. "Sid, who was that man?" she asked him. "Look, I really shouldn't. Please tell me, who was he?" Sid looked back toward Sam's bedroom and then whispered to her, "It's Sam's cousin, Harvey, but don't mention him to Sam, okay? Not unless he brings him up first." "Why?" Sid looked away, not wanting to say anything else, but Mary needed answers. She stepped closer to Sid and made sure that he was looking at her when she asked, "Why shouldn't I mention Harvey?" Sid hesitated and tried to talk himself out of telling her anything more, but she was persistent. Finally, he said, "Because he's dead. Harvey died 2 years ago." Mary felt as though the floor had fallen out from under her. Her heart began to pound in her chest. She tried to tell herself that it must have been someone else at the fair, but it was useless. The eyes were the same. Even the clothes looked the same. She could try to find some way to explain what had happened, but in her gut she knew the truth. She had seen a dead man.
This is the voice of the Embers, where stories burn and fade.